You are the owner of an exciting meme generating website, which takes the images that people submit to you and places them in Habitiat-ize containers. Habitiat-ize. So this is a website we built in a series of exercises prior to this one. Now we want to take this application into production. And that's what we're going to do in this exercise using Habitiat. We're going to show how you can easily build, deploy, and run your applications. Now, I want to take a look at how we currently build, deploy, and run our Ruby application, and then compare it to how we do it with Habitiat. So for a Ruby application, generally there is no build step. We have some sort of tests that might run, some linting and other things like that give us proof that the site or the code is working. But for the most part, we need to wait until we actually deploy and run it into production to see if it's actually physically, it's actually working, right? Now, this might mean there are some surprises along the way. Particularly, well, for the most part, it wouldn't. For these first steps that we have declared here, where we git clone the repository and we run a bundle install, it seems pretty obvious that we would have git installed and Ruby installed for it to work. The other requirement of having ImageMagick is installed is something that we wouldn't know until we actually deployed the application, right? This project has a dependency on our magic, which means the system needs to have ImageMagick. So there's nothing explicitly stating outside of the code what needs to be there for this application to work correctly, right? We assume that Git needs to be installed, Ruby needs to be installed based on these instructions here, but we might miss some of the other requirements defined in the gem. Now, once that's all done, we can simply run rackup and our website is now working on our port. But let's take a look at how Habitiat does that. Now it's going to be a little bit different for you. I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to write out the instructions that I'm going to execute today, but this would be maybe even a little bit easier if you're using Linux or possibly even Windows here. So I'm going to enter into the studio. Then I'm going to run the build command. That's going to take our plan file, which describes how our application should be packaged. It's going to put it all together for us. Then I'm going to choose to export this package into a Docker, essentially a Docker image. I'm going to publish that Docker image to this repository under this origin with this name. And then when it comes time to deploy, in this case, if I were to go into production, I would have to, of course, make sure Docker was installed, and I'm going to be using Docker Compose. That would have to be installed to make sure it works correctly. And of course, we would have to copy the Docker Compose file to the system, similar to like the git clone of a repository. And finally, we run Docker Compose up. So you see there's a bit of a difference in terms of the setup. We're going to see a little bit more work at the build time, which is going to produce for us any errors or requirements that are necessary for our system. I think this is great, and I think this is something that's really going to make it easier when it comes time to deploy our application. So let's get started. Now, when we start thinking about using Habitiat to create a Ruby-based application, it could be a little bit daunting, thinking like, well, I'll need to install Ruby, I'll need to put all these things inside the container for you. But what was great at the Habitiat team put together is this idea of scaffolding. And you can read about it in the blog that's posted, and we also have it in a tutorial that we have outlined, which walks through working with a Ruby project. So here I'm going to follow the instructions alongside of this. Really, and the most important thing is I'm going to run this command right here, hab plan init -s ruby. So this is going to tell me the scaffolding that I'm going to want to use. All right, so the Ruby scaffolding is what I want. Okay, give you a quick introduction of what's taking place here is we have a Habitiat directory that automatically get created. We've got a plan file which contains some values that are set, these key value pairs. We have a default TOML file where we might put some configuration information, and we have other sort of things that might be necessary for application. For this simple application, we don't have to worry about anything but the plan file. Okay, so let's do as I mentioned in the README, which is let's enter the studio. So I'm going to enter the studio here. Actually, let's I think keep the README down here and just keep those steps kind of like there for us always so we can be aware of what we're doing. Great. So I'm going to do a hab studio, hab studio what? Hab studio enter. Now, the Hab Studio is a clean room. This is an environment that allows us to do the work without possibly linking to our own system libraries and things like that. It's a great place that, so in this case, for me on a Mac, I can actually do everything that you might be doing to use a Hab Studio on Linux or Windows or anything like that. Essentially, it levels the playing field so that we're always building in the same environment. I'm going to run the build command. And when I run the build command initially, it's going to tell me that I have an error. And the error is that it failed to build because I did not provide a package version. So I'm going to provide a package version. And this, I'm a man of bold numbers, so I'm going to go with 1.0. This is our exciting meme website. I'm proud of it. Now, we're going to see along the side here, this is going to just walk through installing everything that's necessary for us to build our Ruby application. The reason that we don't have to specify anything other than our version number is that this core scaffolding understands what's necessary. And you'll notice here it installs Ruby, package config, lab.yaml, all the libraries are necessary for it to work. It then actually looks at our gem file inside of our project. From that gem file, it then determines what needs to be installed in the system. It'll even detect things like Postgres databases and other things like that. So here, this is going to resolve our dependencies as far as bundler, git, and other things like that. And then finally, it's going to run bundle install. And you'll see right now, it gives us an error, and it tells us that bundle install was essentially failing because it was failing to build a gem with native extensions. Now, it looks like it's trying to install Sinatra, but it fails. But if we scroll down here, we'll see that it's actually the gem ImageMagick. And you'll see it starts to show us a little bit about what's present on the system and what's not. GCC is, but Magic Conf is not, right? So this Magic Conf is not there. It tells us we could troubleshoot it this way. Well, the thing is, for ImageMagick to be installed, we need to have ImageMagick installed. And for that, we simply need to define a dependency. Now, do we have ImageMagick inside of our possible list of sort of essentially, is that something that we can actually install? Is that a dependency that we can declare that we have? And the one place to look for it would be to go to the depot. And inside the depot, I'm going to look for ImageMagick. And there I have an ImageMagick. So there is a core ImageMagick. I can step through this to learn a little bit more about it. And for me, really, I'm only caring about is the name itself. So I'm going to specify that we have a dependency on ImageMagick. Wonderful. All right, I think it's dependencies. Okay, so let's recompile or rebuild this and see how this goes. Now, things should move a little bit quicker this second time because a lot of things are already there, so dependencies are going to be resolved instead of download and resolve. Here we see that we do a bundle install, and now it's telling us that it's installing ImageMagick with our native extensions. So this is one of those errors, if we think about the previous way we deployed our application, that we wouldn't discover until we actually deployed it into production, right? Until we were actually sitting there waiting, cracking our knuckles and about to deploy everything, we would see that error and then have to go back and say, oh my goodness, our base image is wrong. We have to solve this by installing this new dependency. So this is really nice to be able to figure this out at build time before we leave our environment, before we hand it off to anyone else. Okay, so I've built this. It's now time for me to export it. So I'm going to export this under my origin and with this incredibly awesome name, Habitiat-ize. And while that's going on, we mentioned that we are going to use Docker Compose to run this system. So I need to make a Docker Compose file. So I'm going to open up my Habitiat-ize directory. I'm going to create a Docker Compose YAML file. And if you look at that Habitat tutorial that I mentioned before, they actually give you a basic Habitiat-ize essentially tutorial. They do a basic sort of setup similar to this one. And it's going to show us how we might do a Docker Compose file. I'm not familiar with Docker Compose too well. At least I've never written a file by myself. I usually copy and paste to get started. So here I'm going to change that from a database. We only have one application, but I do want Habitiat-ize. We are going to say, well, let's use Franklin Weber and let's use Habitiat-ize as the name. And then I don't need any volumes. and I don't need a second service, but I do need the ports on my first service to be available to me. So I'm going to use that to do the port forwarding. Now, I'm still in the studio. I believe I need to exit the studio. And at this point, I would copy my Docker Compose file to the system. And now, I think the moment of truth, I'm going to run Docker Compose up. This is going to show me the supervisor here. It's going to tell me, hey, I've started up your service. I've got it running. Here's details about it. Would you like to look at it? Why don't you go to port 8000? So here we go. I'm going to go to localhost 8000. There's my meme green machine. I'm going to select the subject for my local machine. I'm going to select upload image, and boom. All right. So here we go. Now we've got a simple meme generating website that is a pretty common looking sort of Ruby web application using Sinatra, and we can quickly deploy that into production using Habitat, right? So again, the process is a little bit different when we work with Habitat. We're putting a lot more emphasis on the build phase of that. We're building this ahead of time before we deploy it. But this removes a lot of those guesses and questions that we might have about what the environment looks like. It packages it more with the application so that we know it just works.